Now we're going to get the Republican take on this standoff with the number 2 Republican in the Senate, one of the negotiators, Jon Kyl. Well, Senator, what do you make about what Mr. Daley just said? He said, you know, no way here that they're going to do it in 2 steps.
Right. He said no way. Now, who's saying my way or the highway? The House of Representatives twice now has passed budgets, and the second time this cut, cap, and balance would have extended the debt ceiling, and twice the Senate Democrats voted no. So the question is, what can we do now? And I think given the fact that the president did move the goalposts, they've acknowledged that they demanded another $400 billion in taxes. And that's when Speaker Boehner said it's like negotiating with Jell-O down there, and we're not going to do that. So this weekend, he and the other congressional leaders are working on a plan which would provide for a temporary extension of the debt ceiling. Daley is right that nobody wants the credit of the United States to be called into question, and I'm confident that that will not occur, that we will pass an extension of the debt ceiling. And the only question is for how long. It's interesting that since 1972, Congress has raised the debt ceiling for 6 months or less 38 times. So we could surely extend it for 5 or 6 months, have this committee of Congress come back, report on the way to continue to reduce our deficit, and in that way avert the disaster and make forward progress. The problem, I think, is that the single most important thing to President Obama is extending this beyond his re-election campaign. He just doesn't want to have to deal with it again.
Well, in other words, what you're saying, and it looks to me like that what Speaker Boehner is about to do here is sort of call the president's bluff. It sounds like he's going to come out with something this afternoon, whether Democrats in the Senate or in the House agree with it or not. He is going to lay out a plan to raise the debt ceiling at least toward the end of the year. Is that what's about to happen here?
Maybe. I think he wants to make it clear to the markets that we're going to extend the debt ceiling, so we don't have to worry about default. But I also know that the Democratic leader in the Senate, R-Ariz, has been talking a lot with Speaker Boehner, and that both of them want to find a bipartisan way to move this thing forward.
Well, do you think what might happen here is they'll go back to the so-called McConnell-Reed option, which would call for the president to lift the debt ceiling, give him the sole responsibility of lifting the debt ceiling, and then the Congress could vote to disapprove it if they so chose, which basically is just kind of a cover story that people who don't want to vote for raising the debt ceiling. Is that what's going to happen here?
It remains to be seen, and I think that's primarily between Speaker Boehner, Majority Leader Reid, and the other 2 leaders in the Congress. The key here is Boehner's formulation, which I think is quite good, that we should extend the debt ceiling for as long as we reduce spending. In other words, a dollar for dollar. If we can reduce spending by $1 trillion, then we extend the debt ceiling $1 trillion worth, and that would take it at least through the end of this year.
But what if that won't pass the Senate? Mr. Reid says they won't pass the Senate. So what do you do then?
Well, the president then would have to answer a tough question. Is my re-election more important to me than the potential for default of the United States? And as the leader of the United States, he's got to be first and foremost concerned with our credit worthiness. I can't imagine that he would sacrifice the creditworthiness of the United States just because he doesn't want to deal with this during his election campaign.
Let me ask you this, Senator. Do you think that Republicans, particularly those in the freshman class over in the House, understand just how serious this debt limit crisis is? Because so many of them ran for and were elected on a platform of, I promise, no way, no how will I ever raise taxes. So that puts them in a really tough spot. Do you think they understand what might happen if you can't raise this debt limit here?
I'm not sure. Part of the problem, as you point out, is if you look at the public opinion surveys, the majority of Americans don't want us to raise the debt ceiling. What the Republican leadership has said is, look, it's got to be raised, but perhaps we can satisfy the large majority of the American public by accompanying that with large reductions in spending. Spending is our problem here, and if we can show them that we can substantially reduce spending, then maybe we can go ahead and make this debt ceiling extension without too much political repercussion.
Is there a problem for Republicans that might emerge as just the party of no, the party that can't say yes to anything? Do you see that as a political problem?
Bob, I would just put it the other way. The first thing I pointed out was that twice Congress has passed something. They've said yes to something and gotten strongly criticized. As you know, when the Ryan budget was passed, the president, a lot of his folks came out and savaged it. But they've never put a budget on the table. So twice Republicans have said yes. The only thing we haven't said yes to is job-killing tax increases.
The Democrats are having a hard time, a lot of them, with talking about reforming Social Security and Medicare. Republicans, as you point out, are having a hard time with anything that looks like a tax increase. Could you tell me something that Republicans would be willing to compromise on in the way of revenues? I know you want to bring the tax rates down by eliminating some of the deductions. What would be some of the deductions that you might get Republicans to go along with?
Well, let me just back up one stage. I was part of the so-called Biden talks, and we agreed to at least $150 billion in increased revenues. Now, they weren't tax increases, but they were user fees, user fee increases, sale of assets, and so on. So it's not as if we're against revenues. It's just that we don't like to see the tax increases. But on the tax side, we have uniformly said we need tax reform, and the president, we believe, is correct when he said on the corporate tax rate, for example, in order to be more competitive around the world, we need to bring our corporate rate down. We're by far and away the highest in the world, and we could do that by eliminating some of the deductions and credits, and then with that savings, reducing the rate. So that's the way we would prefer to deal with taxes.
Well, just say, for example, would you be willing to eliminate the deduction on mortgage interest rates?
Well, I'll listen to my constituents on that. They'll have a lot to say about it. I think it can be reduced somewhat, but that's something that's very important to a lot of Americans. And so I think the president should be careful about proposing to eliminate, and charitable contributions. I don't want to provide a disincentive for people to contribute to charity. These are the kind of things you've got to be very, very careful about, saying it's easy to reduce, when in fact the American people will have something to say about it.
Senator Kyl, thank you very much for
Thank you,
giving
Bob.
your side of this story.